The Harper apartment overlooked a narrow Brooklyn street where the sound of traffic softened into something almost domestic at night. Daniel Harper often stood by the window after work, loosening his tie, watching headlights stretch and dissolve against the brick buildings like thoughts he never quite finished. Marriage, he believed, was made of such moments, unfinished thoughts, shared silences, and the decision not to interrogate every pause. Olivia moved through the apartment with practiced elegance. Even at home, she carried herself like someone who might be observed. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floors as she moved between rooms, phone always nearby, fingers trained by years of emails and deadlines. Daniel noticed that she rarely sat still anymore. When she did, her mind was elsewhere. They had not fought in years. That, Daniel told himself, was a good sign. On the evening everything fractured, Daniel came home earlier than usual. A client meeting had been canceled, and he welcomed the rare gift of unscheduled time. The apartment smelled faintly of Olivia's perfume, something expensive, unfamiliar, purchased during a recent work trip. He made a mental note to ask about it later. Olivia was in the study, door half closed. Light spilled into the hallway. Daniel could hear her voice low, intimate, unguarded in a way he hadn't heard directed at him in a long time. He didn't mean to listen. He paused only because she said his name. "Daniel doesn't know," Olivia said softly, almost kindly. "He's good. He trusts me." The word trust landed with weight. Daniel remained still, hand resting against the wall. The city's noise fading into something distant and unreal. His heartbeat slowed, as if bracing itself. "I didn't plan this," she continued. "It just happened. And then it kept happening." There was a pause, a breath, a faint laugh that carried relief rather than guilt. "I know it's wrong," Olivia said, "but I feel like myself again." Daniel closed his eyes. She spoke of longing, of feeling invisible, of nights where desire felt like oxygen after years underwater. She did not speak of love. That omission hurt more than any declaration would have. When the call ended, Daniel stepped back into the living room, careful not to make a sound. He sat on the couch, hands folded, waiting. Olivia emerged moments later, her expression composed, professional. "You're home early," she said, smiling as she leaned down to kiss his cheek. Daniel felt the ghost of her words linger between them. "Yes," he replied simply. They ate dinner together. Olivia talked about a campaign launch. Daniel listened, nodding in the right places, marveling at how easily life continued. The marriage breathed in and out, unaware it had already suffered a fatal wound. That night, Daniel did not sleep. By morning, he had made his decision. He packed a single suitcase, left his wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside a note that contained no explanation, only a bank account number and the words, "Take care of yourself." When Olivia woke to the silence, Daniel was already gone. Daniel had always believed that truth announced itself loudly through shouting, slammed doors, or the unmistakable collapse of routine. He never imagined it would arrive quietly, almost politely, slipping into his life on the back of a voice lowered in intimacy. The study light was still on when he returned from rinsing his coffee mug. Olivia rarely worked that late at home anymore. She preferred glass offices and city views, places where ambition felt justified by architecture. Daniel paused in the hallway, meaning only to remind her that dinner was getting cold. Her voice stopped him, not because it was secretive, but because it was unguarded. "I told you it can't be tonight," Olivia said softly. There was no irritation in her tone, only a careful tenderness. "He's home." Daniel leaned against the wall without realizing it. The hallway seemed longer than it had ever been, the air thicker, as though the apartment itself were holding its breath. "He doesn't suspect anything," she continued. "Daniel trusts me. He always has." Trust. The word echoed with a weight that surprised him. It wasn't anger that rose first, but something colder, a slow recalibration of reality, like a map being redrawn while you were still walking. Olivia paced as she spoke, her silhouette crossing the glass panel of the study door. Daniel knew that rhythm, the way she moved when she felt understood on the other end of a conversation. It was the same cadence she once used with him, years ago when they were still learning each other's vulnerabilities. I didn't mean for it to turn into this, she said after a pause. At first it was just talking, feeling seen again. Daniel's stomach tightened. He realized he was breathing shallowly, as though full breaths might alert the universe to his presence. Another pause, then quieter. I know it's wrong. The admission did not bring relief. It came without shame, without urgency. Wrong in Olivia's voice sounded more like inconvenient. But I haven't felt this alive in years. Alive. Daniel closed his eyes. The word landed with surgical precision, cutting without spectacle. He thought of the evenings they spent together in silence, the careful routines they had perfected. He had mistaken peace for fulfillment, stability for intimacy. There was no mention of love. That omission was almost merciful. Desire he could understand in theory. Longing, even betrayal, but love would have rewritten everything. Olivia laughed softly at something said on the other end of the line. It was a private sound, one Daniel hadn't heard in a long time. We'll be careful, she said. I promise. Daniel stepped back, retreating into the living room as if distance could undo what he had already absorbed. He sat down slowly, his body moving with mechanical obedience, while his mind raced ahead, cataloging memories, replaying moments now stripped of innocence. He remembered the new perfume, subtle, expensive, chosen by someone who wanted to be noticed. The late meetings, the way Olivia sometimes turned her phone face down on the table. Clues, all of them. He had seen them. He had chosen not to name them. When Olivia emerged from the study minutes later, her expression was calm, her posture composed. She looked at Daniel as though nothing in the world had shifted. You're quiet, she said lightly. Long day, he replied. She smiled, leaning in to kiss his cheek. The gesture was familiar, almost affectionate. Daniel felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing his own life from a distance. Noting details without emotion, they ate dinner together. Olivia talked about work clients, deadlines, the city's relentless pace. Daniel nodded at appropriate intervals, responding when spoken to, performing normalcy with unsettling ease. Inside, something was already rearranging itself. That night, Daniel lay awake beside her, listening to the cadence of her breathing. Olivia slept soundly, one hand resting lightly on his chest, as though claiming territory she no longer occupied in spirit. He stared at the ceiling and realized that confrontation would change nothing. Accusations would invite defense. Tears might invite regret, but regret was not the same as truth. He did not want explanations that softened reality. He did not want apologies shaped by fear of loss, rather than recognition of harm. What unsettled him most was not the affair itself, but the ease with which Olivia inhabited it. The calm honesty of her confession, spoken to someone else, not him, suggested that the marriage had already become a structure she moved around, not within. By morning, clarity arrived without drama. Daniel rose quietly, careful not to wake her. He showered, dressed, and moved through the apartment with a new attentiveness, noticing how little of himself was anchored there anymore. The bookshelves held more of Olivia's awards than his own work. The walls displayed photographs from trips she had planned. He packed a single suitcase. Before leaving, he paused in the kitchen. The sun had just begun to filter through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. He removed his wedding ring and placed it on the counter. Beside it, he left a short note, no accusations, no explanations. Just the logistics, just the exit. When he closed the door behind him, the sound was barely audible. And yet, it marked the end of everything they had been. Olivia woke to silence. Not the restful kind, the kind that follows a good night's sleep, but a silence that felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. The space beside her was cold, the sheet barely creased, as though Daniel had never been there at all. She sat up slowly, disoriented. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the bedroom wall. For a moment she assumed he had gone for an early walk, maybe to clear his head. Daniel had always processed life quietly, internally. That was one of the things she admired about him. Daniel? She called, her voice tentative. No answer. She moved through the apartment barefoot, the hardwood cool beneath her feet. The living room was immaculate, too immaculate. No coffee mug on the counter, no jacket draped over the chair. The absence was precise, deliberate. Then she saw it. The wedding ring lay on the kitchen counter, perfectly centered, catching the light. Beside it, a folded note. Her breath caught not sharply, but with a slow, spreading unease. She unfolded the paper. No accusations, no explanations. Only numbers bank information and a single line written in Daniel's restrained handwriting. Take care of yourself. Olivia read it twice, then a third time. Her first reaction was irritation. This silence felt theatrical, passive, cowardly. She reached for her phone immediately, dialing his number with a practiced certainty that it would ring, that he would answer, that this was all some misunderstanding. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. By the third attempt, irritation gave way to confusion. Confusion, in turn, slipped quietly into fear. She walked into the bedroom, opened his closet, half empty. The suits he wore most often were gone. A pair of shoes missing, his passport drawer empty. Daniel hadn't stepped out. He had erased himself. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, phone still in her hand, staring at the wall as her mind raced through possibilities. An accident, a breakdown, a cruel attempt to scare her. But even in her spiraling thoughts, one truth surfaced with unsettling clarity. Daniel was not impulsive. Whatever this was, he had decided it long before she woke up. The hours that followed unfolded in fragments. She called his office in. No one there had heard from him. She texted his sister, careful with her wording. Have you spoken to Daniel? The response came hours later. No. Why? By afternoon, the apartment felt cavernous. Olivia paced, replaying the previous night with forensic intensity. The dinner conversation, the polite questions, the way Daniel had kissed her forehead before bed. Had he known then? The thought made her chest tighten. She remembered the phone call, the one she thought was private. She had been careful, she told herself. Quiet. But Daniel was observant. Always had been. A cold realization settled in. He hadn't left in anger. He had left in certainty. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel did not resurface. No email, no message, no lawyer's letter. The absence became a presence, heavy, invasive, impossible to ignore. Friends asked questions. Olivia deflected with practiced ease, offering vague explanations about space and time apart. In private, she unraveled. What haunted her was not abandonment, but the lack of confrontation. No shouting, no accusations, no opportunity to explain, to justify, to apologize. Daniel had denied her a narrative. Without his anger, she had nowhere to place her guilt. Without his pain, she had no mirror in which to see the damage she had done. At night, she lay awake imagining conversations that would never happen. In one version, he yelled. In another, he cried. In all of them, he stayed. But reality was quieter, crueler. Months later, a letter arrived, not from Daniel, but from a law firm in another state. The language was clean, impersonal. Divorce proceedings. Assets divided with unsettling fairness. Daniel was not punishing her. He was exiting her life with surgical precision. Olivia signed the papers with trembling hands. Each signature felt like consent to a story she did not control. Friends whispered. Colleagues speculated. Some blamed Daniel, called him weak, evasive. Others blamed her, their sympathy thinly veiled. Society, she realized, needed villains. It could not tolerate silence. She threw herself into work. Promotions came. Applause followed. On social media, her life looked intact, thriving even. But success felt hollow without someone to witness it honestly. Years passed. The affair ended, predictably. It could not survive daylight. Subsequent relationships followed a similar pattern, intense, promising, ultimately unsatisfying. Men wanted her brilliance, her beauty, her confidence. None of them asked her the questions Daniel never did. Sometimes late at night, Olivia searched for him online. Daniel Harper was not easy to find. No Instagram, no LinkedIn updates beyond a relocation notice years earlier. It was as if he had stepped sideways out of the digital world, choosing obscurity in an age that punished it. What remained was the silence. Not explosive, not dramatic, just devastating in its endurance. She began to understand then that closure was not something one person could take away from another. It was something you forfeited when you chose not to speak the truth at the moment it mattered most. Daniel had not disappeared to hurt her. He had disappeared to survive. And that, Olivia realized too late, was the cost she would carry forever. By the 5th year after Daniel's disappearance, Olivia Harper had become a woman people admired from a distance. Her name appeared regularly in industry panels and marketing journals. She stood on stages in tailored suits, speaking with clarity and conviction about brand identity, resilience, and reinvention. Younger colleagues watched her with a mixture of envy and aspiration. She was proof that survival could look elegant. If anyone asked about her marriage, she offered a practiced response, measured, gracious, vague. It ended quietly, she would say. Sometimes things do. The truth was that nothing inside her had ended at all. The apartment changed first. She moved out of Brooklyn into a sleek Manhattan high-rise, all glass and steel and city views that made loneliness feel intentional rather than accidental. The decor was minimalist, deliberate, no framed photographs, no personal clutter. Everything curated as if emotion itself might leave fingerprints. At work, she thrived. Late nights felt purposeful. Success gave her structure when intimacy no longer could. Applause replaced affection. Metrics replaced meaning. But silence followed her home. At night, when the city dimmed and the apartment reflected only her own image back at her, Olivia replayed the same questions in endless rotation. How long had he known? Had he stopped loving her before he left her because he left? Was his silence mercy or contempt? She never received answers. Friends offered opinions instead. Some defended her fiercely. He should have talked to you, they said. Disappearing like that? That's emotional cruelty. Others were less kind, their sympathy edged with judgment. Affairs have consequences, they reminded her gently, as if she needed instruction in regret. What no one understood was that Olivia had already sentenced herself. There was no villain she could point to comfortably, not Daniel, not herself. Without confrontation, the story lacked shape. Without dialogue, there was no resolution. She existed in the aftermath of an explosion that had never made a sound. Dating became a performance. Men were drawn to her confidence, her self-possession, the illusion that she had moved on. She let them believe it. Early conversations stayed light. Work trips doubled as escapes. Intimacy arrived quickly and faded just as fast. Each relationship ended the same way, quietly, politely, inexplicably. "You're here," one man told her once, standing in her immaculate kitchen. "But it's like there's a locked room in you I'm not allowed to enter." She didn't argue. In moments of rare honesty, Olivia admitted to herself that no one had ever fully entered that room after Daniel left. Not because she loved him still in any simple way, but because his absence had become structural, a missing beam holding the rest of her emotional architecture in tension. Sometimes late at night, she opened the old email account she had once shared with him. It was inactive now, a digital relic. She searched his name out of habit, not hope, nothing. She imagined him living somewhere quieter. A smaller city, perhaps. A life stripped down to essentials. The thought unsettled her more than imagining him unhappy ever could. Because peace implied choice. Publicly, Olivia became an emblem of strength. She gave interviews about navigating failure. She mentored women recovering from public divorces, professional setbacks, personal reinventions. Her words were measured, empowering, applauded. Privately, she unraveled in increments too small for anyone to notice. Insomnia settled in. Wine became a routine rather than a treat. Mirrors felt increasingly accusatory. On more than one occasion, she found herself standing in her bathroom at 3 in the morning, gripping the edge of the sink, staring at her own reflection as though it might finally speak. "What did you expect?" she whispered once. The answer never came. Society had its narrative. A successful woman, a failed marriage, a cautionary tale wrapped in admiration. People assumed she had paid her price. That loneliness, briefly endured, was sufficient punishment for betrayal. They were wrong. The punishment was not loneliness. It was uncertainty. The not knowing calcified inside her, shaping every decision, every connection. Daniel's refusal to explain had denied her not only forgiveness, but meaning. Without his anger, she could not measure the depth of her wrongdoing. Without his grief, she could not calibrate her own. Years after the divorce was finalized, Olivia attended a conference in Seattle. The hotel bar was dim, crowded with professionals unwinding into anonymity. She sat alone scrolling through her phone when she overheard a familiar cadence of voice nearby, calm, deliberate. For one impossible second, she thought it was Daniel. Her heart surged violently before logic intervened. She turned anyway. It wasn't him. The disappointment was physical, immediate, embarrassing. She excused herself early that night, returning to her room where the city lights flickered like distant signals she could no longer interpret. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she felt the weight of years pressed down, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Daniel had not haunted her with presence. He had haunted her with restraint. His disappearance had been absolute. No attempts at control, no punishment disguised as morality. Just a boundary so firm it rendered her irrelevant to his future. And that was the truth she could barely endure. Not that she had lost him, but that he had chosen a life in which she no longer mattered enough to confront. As dawn crept through the curtains, Olivia lay back and closed her eyes, knowing that whatever success awaited her next, whatever accolades or relationships or reinventions followed, they would always exist in the shadow of a man who had left without asking to be understood. The world saw her strength. No one saw the cost. Daniel Harper learned quickly that distance was not the same as forgetting. The town he chose was unremarkable by designating a coastal city in Northern California, where mornings arrived quietly and strangers respected silence. The streets were wide, the pace unhurried. The kind of place where a man could exist without being constantly asked who he had been before. He rented a small apartment near the water. Nothing luxurious. Clean lines, neutral colors, a space that asked little of him and reflected even less. The first night there, he slept on the floor with his suitcase still unopened, listening to the unfamiliar cadence of waves instead of traffic. It felt like starting over, but without optimism. Daniel took a job with a mid-sized architecture firm that specialized in public spaces, libraries, community centers, modest civic buildings meant to endure rather than impress. The work suited him. There was dignity in designing places where people gathered quietly, where lives intersected without spectacle. His colleagues knew him as capable, reserved, reliable. No one asked about his past beyond casual pleasantries. He offered little voluntarily. In an age of oversharing, restraint passed for professionalism. That was how he preferred it. Grief did not announce itself. It arrived in fragments, an empty chair across from him at dinner, a reflexive glance toward a phone he no longer expected to ring. Some nights he dreamed of Brooklyn streets and woke disoriented, momentarily convinced he had imagined his departure. But the quiet held. Daniel did not contact Olivia, not out of cruelty, not out of strategy. He simply understood that words, once withheld, could not be offered later without distortion. Any explanation would reopen a wound he had closed with deliberate care. Silence for him was not punishment. It was preservation. He attended therapy for a while, sitting across from a woman who asked careful questions and respected long pauses. He spoke about betrayal without detailing it, about leaving without naming names. "You didn't confront her," the therapist observed once. "Why?" Daniel considered the question longer than necessary. "Because confrontation would have required me to ask her to care," he said finally, "and I'd already heard enough to know she didn't, at least not in the way that mattered." He dated cautiously, brief connections, honest boundaries. When asked about his past, he offered a version of the truth that lacked drama. "My marriage ended," he would say. "I chose not to stay." Some women pressed for more, others didn't. None of them frightened him with familiarity. He noticed that intimacy no longer tempted him into overextension. He had learned the cost of assuming permanence. Still, unresolved grief lingered like a low-grade ache. There were moments, unexpected, uninvited, when Olivia surfaced in his mind. A particular song, a professional milestone he imagined she would have understood. The sound of laughter drifting from a neighboring table. He did not hate her. That surprised him most. Hatred would have tethered him to the past, kept the connection alive through opposition. What he felt instead was something quieter, heavier, a recognition that love, once compromised, could not be negotiated back into shape. He had not disappeared to make a point. He had disappeared because staying would have required him to become someone he did not respect, suspicious, resentful, perpetually bargaining for honesty. Distance gave him back his own outline. Years passed. Daniel advanced professionally, his work earning recognition for its restraint and clarity. He volunteered occasionally, mentored younger architects, cooked simple meals, took long walks by the water. His life lacked spectacle, but it held coherence. Sometimes people mistook his quiet for loneliness. They were wrong. Loneliness had been the marriage after the truth surfaced, sleeping beside someone who no longer shared his interior world. What he lived with now was solitude, chosen, structured, honest. On the anniversary of his departure, Daniel took the day off work without consciously intending to. He walked along the shoreline, watching waves erase their own footprints as soon as they formed. He thought about the man he had been faithful, accommodating, unassuming. He thought about the man he was becoming, measured, self-contained, intact. The grief had not vanished. It no longer needed to. What he had built instead was a boundary so clear it required no explanation. A life defined not by what he escaped, but by what he refused to carry forward. Daniel never checked Olivia's social media, never searched her name. That chapter, once closed, remained closed, not out of denial, but out of respect for the person he had become. Silence, he had learned, could be an act of integrity. And in that silence, he found something unexpected: peace. Olivia Harper had built a life that looked enviable from the outside, a corner office with panoramic city views, a wardrobe that spoke of impeccable taste, a social calendar packed with dinners, galas, and speaking engagements. But each achievement, each accolade, was a veneer stretched over a deep, persistent ache. Men entered her life, one after another, drawn to her confidence, her success, her charm. They admired the way she moved through rooms, commanding attention effortlessly. Yet every relationship faltered. No one could penetrate the walls Daniel had inadvertently helped her build, the walls she didn't even know she was reinforcing. She dated men who were ambitious, charismatic, even kind. Yet conversations never reached the level of truth she craved or feared. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet comparison shadowed every intimate moment. Would Daniel have? That question, unspoken, was a relentless judge. She found herself measuring warmth, humor, and affection against the benchmark of a man who had left quietly, with dignity intact. Guilt, too, shadowed her constantly. The memory of the overheard confession, the knowledge that she had betrayed the person who had trusted her most, lingered like a quiet ghost. She excused herself in therapy sessions, explaining failed connections with busy schedules, career demands, or incompatible personalities, but the truth remained unspoken. She could not forgive herself fully. Daniel had disappeared, leaving her with the consequences of choices she could neither undo nor justify. Success lost its taste. Winning campaigns, awards, and recognition felt hollow. The applause was muted by the constant question, was any of it meaningful if I could not reconcile with my own past? She learned to nod politely in boardrooms, to smile at colleagues' admiration, and to speak with polished eloquence at conferences, but behind the mask she was a woman haunted by absence and silence. Social gatherings became exercises in performance. She laughed at jokes she barely heard, offered condolences she didn't feel, complimented colleagues she envied. Her public image was one of control and poise. Her private reality was one of relentless introspection and private collapse. Even intimacy brought no relief. In rare moments of closeness, she found herself distracted, comparing a partner's gestures, voice, and touch to memories of Daniel's absent presence. Nothing could measure up. Men would leave, perplexed, sensing the barrier, yet never understanding it fully. Olivia realized too late that Daniel had exacted a cost she could never repay, not through confrontation or revenge, but through the quiet strength of his disappearance. By now she understood that moving on was not linear. It was iterative, cruelly selective, leaving some chapters unresolved and some wounds perpetually fresh. Every choice she made carried the invisible weight of history, a history where love, betrayal, and silence intersected in ways no success could mitigate. She looked in the mirror one morning, dressed for a major presentation. The woman staring back was polished, strong, and commanding, but her eyes carried shadows of questions that no accolades could answer. The cost of moving on, she realized, was not just solitude or regret. It was the surrender of narrative control, the surrender of absolution she would never receive. Success, she understood, could never heal what silence had severed. And in that realization, the sharp truth settled. Some departures do not leave scars, they leave spaces that nothing and no one can ever fill. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in San Francisco, the kind of day when the fog clung to the bay like a hesitant memory. Olivia Harper had flown across the country for a marketing summit, one of the many speaking engagements that kept her life in motion, yet suspended from real connection. She checked into her hotel, dropped her luggage, and wandered into a nearby cafe to gather her thoughts before a panel discussion. She did not expect to see him. The cafe was small, tucked into a side street. Steam curled from espresso machines. The scent of roasted coffee mingled with faint traces of pastry. Olivia moved toward the counter, scanning tables for an empty seat, when she froze. Daniel Harper. Not in the way she remembered him, no traces of anger, no tension in his shoulders, but calm, composed, unhurried. He sat by a window, a laptop open in front of him, a book beside it. The sunlight fell across his face, highlighting the quiet certainty that had always unnerved her. He looked peaceful. Her chest tightened. Questions she had carried for years surged forward. Why didn't he fight? Did he ever care? Was he angry? He looked up, eyes meeting hers briefly. Recognition flashed, swift, neutral, and undramatic. No shock, no longing, just acknowledgement. Like two parallel lines finally intersecting without colliding. For a moment she could not move, her voice stuck. Her carefully constructed mask faltered. All the rehearsed speeches, all the confident smiles, all the polite deflections dissolved in the presence of a man who had chosen dignity over drama. Daniel closed his laptop slowly, sliding a bookmark into the book beside him. He did not rise. He did not approach. His posture was deliberate, unassuming, yet it radiated a boundary she had never breached before. Daniel, she whispered, though it sounded like her own echo. He nodded once. No words. She sat at a nearby table, ordering a coffee she barely tasted, her mind replaying years of absence. The truth she sought was not punishment or confrontation, it was understanding. And in that realization, she saw the cost of her previous assumptions. He had never hated her. He had never sought revenge. He had simply chosen a life that preserved his peace, leaving her to live with hers. The cafe filled with mundane noises, a grinder buzzing, the soft hum of conversation, the clink of spoons. In the middle of it all, Daniel existed as both a relic and a revelation. The silence between them spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Olivia realized that for years she had carried the weight of imagined anger, resentment she had never seen, blame she had never received. What she had mistaken for absence as punishment was actually absence as self-preservation. Tears came unbidden, not in shame, not in anger, but in recognition. She had been punished by nothing more than truth itself. Daniel had lived according to his own integrity, and she had lived in the shadow of her guilt without closure. He spoke at last, quietly, without accusation. "Olivia," he said, "I hope you're well." That was it. No explanation, no justification, no moral judgment, just peace. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and in that moment Olivia understood that closure does not always arrive in dramatic statements. Sometimes it is offered simply by witnessing the other person's equilibrium, their calm endurance, their choice to remain unshaken. She left the cafe before he could rise, before conversation could unfold. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the bay glinting in the afternoon sun. Olivia walked along the sidewalk, absorbing the weight she had carried and slowly releasing it. The past had resurfaced, not to punish, not to reconcile, but to illuminate the truth she had avoided. Some people leave quietly, and some departures demand nothing more than recognition. And in that recognition, she found a fragile, bittersweet freedom. Olivia Harper returned from San Francisco carrying a new kind of weight, not of guilt or longing, but of acknowledgement. She understood, with a clarity that had eluded her for years, that some losses are permanent, some silences cannot be filled, some departures cannot be undone. Daniel's life had moved forward without her. Hers had done the same, each in separate, irrevocable paths. In her Manhattan apartment, the city hummed around her like a reminder of constant motion. She went through the motions of daily life, emails, meetings, dinners, panels. But the difference now was subtle yet profound. There was no pretense of control over past events, no frantic attempt to justify or compensate. She had lived through betrayal, abandonment, and regret, and now she could simply observe the consequences without trying to rewrite them. She thought of Daniel not with anger or longing, but with respect. His choice to leave quietly, without confrontation, had been a statement of integrity, not a weapon aimed at her. For years, she had imagined his absence as punishment. Now she understood it was a boundary of life preserved, not a vendetta executed. That understanding did not absolve her. It did not erase the mistakes or the pain, but it offered perspective, a lens through which the past could be seen without distortion. Her relationships remained cautious, deliberate. She did not seek to replace Daniel, nor did she chase the illusion of closure. Men entered her life, some stayed briefly, others departed quietly. She treated them as chapters, not solutions. The lessons she had learned, the fragility of trust, the consequences of betrayal, the necessity of self-respect became guides rather than burdens. There were nights when she still thought of him, moments when the ache of unresolved questions resurfaced. But those moments were no longer crushing, they were just reminders of choices made, of lives let apart. She did not try to call, to search, or to demand explanation. She simply let the memory exist, as one lets a painting hang on a wall, visible, acknowledged, untouchable. The divorce, the affair, the years of absence all had shaped her, but none could define her completely. She had rebuilt herself not in reaction to Daniel, but through the quiet accumulation of her own resilience and insight. Success, love, and connection were now experienced in fragments, appreciated for what they were, not what they failed to replace. On a crisp evening, standing on her balcony overlooking the skyline, Olivia inhaled the city air deeply. The lights reflected off glass towers, a multitude of lives moving in parallel, intersecting, diverging. She felt the permanence of some losses and accepted it fully. No reconciliation awaited her. No dramatic scene, no cinematic reunion, only the knowledge that life continues, sometimes with absence at its center, and sometimes with silence as the most profound teacher. Olivia smiled faintly, a gesture private and unremarkable, yet meaningful. She had survived betrayal, abandonment, and uncertainty. She had witnessed the cost of choices, both hers and his. And she had learned finally that acceptance does not require forgiveness. Some truths, some departures simply exist. Some people, once gone, remain gone. And in that quiet acknowledgement, she discovered an unexpected freedom. The freedom to live fully, to love cautiously, and to carry the past without being imprisoned by it. The city hummed below, indifferent and eternal. Olivia turned from the balcony and walked back into her apartment, into her life fragile, measured and undeniably her own.